11 years ago, I sat cross-legged on our kitchen floor with a second-hand laptop balanced on a moving box, typing code until 3 in the morning, while my husband slept upstairs, certain that whatever I was building would amount to nothing more than a hobby. I never corrected him. I let him believe that. It was easier that way, and besides, I had learned long before I met him that the quietest person in the room is usually the one paying the closest attention. By the time our company had a name people recognized, a headquarters with his name on the door, and investors who called him a visionary, I had learned to disappear into the background of my own creation. I signed where I was told to sign. I smiled when photographers asked us to stand together. I stayed late finishing what no one else understood how to finish, and I told myself that love didn't need credit to be real. On the night of our 11th anniversary, surrounded by his family in a private dining room I had chosen the flowers for, he rose with a glass of champagne in his hand and told the table that a founder needed a wife who looked the part. He said her name like it was a gift he was giving all of us. His mother laughed first, then his brothers, then, eventually, everyone. I did not cry. I did not raise my voice. I folded my napkin, set it beside my untouched plate, and watched the candlelight move across his face, while he waited for me to fall apart in front of the people who had never once asked what I actually did all day. 3 days later, my phone rang at 11 in the morning. It was his lawyer, and his voice was not the voice of a man delivering routine news. He asked me, very carefully, why every patent the company had ever filed carried only one name on it: mine. The dining room still smelled like the lilies I had chosen that morning, white and heavy and expensive, the kind of flowers you buy when you want a room to remember you were there. I had picked them myself, the way I had picked everything for 11 years, the caterer, the seating chart, the wine that paired with the salmon his mother liked, and the beef his father pretended not to prefer. I had always been good at making rooms feel like they belonged to someone else. When Daniel stood up with his glass raised, I assumed for one foolish half-second that he was going to thank me. It would not have been the first time he forgot to, and it would not have been the first time I forgave it before he even asked. But he didn't look at me. He looked at Priya, seated 2 chairs down in the navy dress I recognized from a company retreat photo I had scrolled past without letting myself feel anything. "A founder needs a wife who looks the part," he said, and he smiled like he had rehearsed the line in a mirror, testing it for warmth. I watched his mother's face first, because I always watched her first. Eleanor did not look surprised. That detail settled into me quietly, the way cold water finds the lowest point in a room. She had known, maybe longer than I wanted to imagine. The laughter came in waves, first from his brothers, then from the investors he'd invited who barely knew me beyond my maiden name on old paperwork, then from people who had eaten at my table more times than I could count. I kept my hands folded in my lap and studied the condensation sliding down my water glass, and I made myself a promise I had made only once before in my life, on a night I rarely let myself remember. I would not give this room the satisfaction of watching me break. Daniel finally glanced at me, waiting. I think he wanted tears. I think, in some small and ugly corner of himself, he wanted a scene he could later describe as regrettable but understandable, the kind of story that would make Priya seem like a rescue rather than a betrayal. I gave him nothing. I lifted my glass an inch, the smallest possible gesture, and set it back down without drinking from it. Then I asked the server, quite calmly, whether the kitchen could bring the dessert out a little early, because I had an early meeting. I did have an early meeting. I always had an early meeting. It was the one part of my life that had remained entirely, uncontestedly mine. I drove home alone that night because Daniel stayed behind to smooth things over, with a table full of people who did not need smoothing, and I sat in our driveway for 11 minutes before I could make myself go inside. 11 minutes. 1 for every year. I did not cry there either. I thought instead, with a clarity that frightened me a little, about the laptop on the kitchen table, about the nights I had spent teaching myself patent law out of stubbornness because our first attorney kept billing us for mistakes, about the clause I had insisted on years ago when Daniel wanted to file everything jointly under the company's name, and I had quietly, without explanation, refused. He had called it my one strange hill to die on. He used to tease me about it at dinner parties, tell people his wife had trust issues with paperwork, and everyone would laugh the easy laugh of people who assumed the joke was on me. I went inside and made tea I didn't drink. I sat at the same kitchen table, worn now, replaced twice but always the same spot against the window, and I opened my laptop the way I had 1,000 nights before. I did not look at wedding photos or scroll through old messages, searching for the moment things had changed. I opened a folder I had not touched in 3 years, one labeled only with a date, and I began, calmly, to read. 3 days later, when the phone rang and a lawyer I did not recognize asked me, with real fear in his voice, why my name was the only one on every patent the company had ever filed, I already knew the answer. I had simply been waiting for someone else to ask the question. The lawyer's name was Mr. Holloway, and he introduced himself twice, as though the first time hadn't registered with either of us. I let him talk. That was something I had learned a long time ago. People tell you far more when you let the silence do the work for you. Mrs. Whitfield, he said, and I noted that he still used my married name. I've been asked to prepare the intellectual property transfer for the upcoming restructuring, and I've run into what I can only describe as an irregularity. An irregularity. I almost laughed. 11 years of late nights, of learning contract law from library books because we couldn't afford a real attorney in the early days, of insisting, quietly, firmly, without ever raising my voice, that every patent application list me and only me as inventor of record, and he was calling it an irregularity. What kind of irregularity? I asked, keeping my voice as even as the surface of a still pond. Every core patent, he said, the compression algorithm, the routing architecture, the security framework, every single filing lists Elena Whitfield as sole inventor. Not Daniel, not the company, you. I looked out the kitchen window at the garden I had planted the year we moved in, the roses I'd trained along the back fence with more patience than I'd ever given anything else in my life, and I said, "That's correct." There was a pause on the line long enough that I could hear him breathing, recalibrating. Mr. Whitfield believes there's been some kind of clerical error. He's asked me to correct the record before the acquisition talks move forward. Acquisition talks. That was new information, delivered carelessly, the way important things often slip out of people who are too rattled to guard them properly. Daniel hadn't mentioned any acquisition. Then again, Daniel hadn't mentioned Priya either, not until he'd stood up with a glass of champagne in a room full of witnesses. "There's no error to correct," I said. "Those filings are accurate. I wrote the algorithms myself, Mr. Holloway. Every patent lists the true inventor, because that's what the law requires. If you'd like, I can send you the lab notebooks. I still have all of them." I did still have them. 11 leather notebooks, dated and initialed, sitting in a fireproof box in the attic that Daniel had never once asked about, because Daniel had never once needed to understand the difference between an idea and its execution. He was the one who could sell a room on a vision. I was the one who had built the thing the vision described. Mr. Holloway's voice dropped. Careful now, the voice of a man realizing he'd wandered into the middle of something larger than a scheduling conflict. "Mrs. Whitfield, if the patents are solely in your name, then legally, the underlying technology belongs to me," I finished for him. "Yes." He didn't say anything for a long moment, and in that silence, I thought about the day Daniel had first suggested filing everything under the company, casually, over breakfast, the way he suggested most things that would have quietly erased me. I thought about how easy it would have been to agree, exhausted as I was, eager as I was to be seen as a partner instead of a founder who happened to also cook dinner. And I thought about the version of me who had said no anyway, who couldn't fully explain why at the time, except that some old instinct, some early wound I'd carried since long before Daniel, told her never again to build something valuable and hand someone else the only proof that she'd built it. "I'd like to schedule a meeting," Mr. Holloway said finally, "with you directly, not through Mr. Whitfield's office." "I think that's wise," I said. After I hung up, I sat with the phone in my lap for a long time, watching the roses sway faintly in the wind, and I let myself feel, for the first time in 3 days, something other than composure. Not triumph. Not yet. Something quieter and more dangerous than that. I felt the ground shift beneath a house I no longer wanted to live in. My phone buzzed again almost immediately, this time with a text from a name I hadn't seen appear on my screen in nearly 2 years. Marcus, our first investor, the one Daniel had eased out of the company back when he decided the story of a self-made founder sounded better without a cosigner attached to it. The message read, "We need to talk. It's about the acquisition. There's something you should see before Daniel finds out you already know." I stared at Marcus's name for longer than I care to admit. 2 years of silence, and now this. A message arriving like a hand reaching up out of water I hadn't realized I was still standing in. I remembered him mostly in fragments. The folding table in our first office, if you could call a converted garage an office. The way he used to bring coffee for me specifically, black, no sugar, because he'd noticed early on that I was usually the last one still working when he left, and the first one there when he arrived. The way his voice had gone tight and careful, the day Daniel told him, over lunch neither of us was invited to, that the company was moving in a cleaner direction. Cleaner meaning without an early investor whose stake might complicate a future funding round. I had asked Daniel about it once, gently, the way I asked about most things back then. He'd told me Marcus had been difficult, demanding, hard to work with. I hadn't pushed. I told myself it wasn't my business, that Daniel handled the business side, and I handled the building, and that division of labor had felt, at the time, like partnership, instead of what it actually was, which was erasure happening one quiet decision at a time. I called Marcus instead of texting back. He answered on the first ring, like he'd been holding the phone. "Elena." His voice had aged, roughened slightly, but the warmth in it was immediate and unchanged. "I wasn't sure you'd call. You said there was something I should see." "I did." A pause, papers shifting somewhere on his end. I still get looped into industry channels, old habit, people who used to know me, words going around that Meridian Capital is close to acquiring Whitfield Systems. 9 figures, Elena, and Daniel's been telling investors the technology is fully owned and unencumbered by the company. "It's not," I said quietly. "I know that now, but he's been telling them that for months. If this deal closes, and then someone discovers the core patents are held personally by you, someone who isn't listed anywhere in the acquisition paperwork, that's not just an irregularity. That's misrepresentation to investors. That could unravel the whole deal, maybe worse." I sat very still at the kitchen table. The same worn patch on the wood, where my elbow had rested for 11 years of late nights, and I let that settle over me. Daniel hadn't simply humiliated me at a dinner in front of his family. He had been building toward something for months, something that required the world to believe I didn't exist as anything more than a wife who didn't look the part, and he had done it without once checking whether the story he was selling was actually true. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked. "You could sell that information to a dozen people who'd pay for it." Marcus laughed, low and without much humor in it. "Because I watched you build that company from nothing while he took the meetings and gave the interviews. Because when he pushed me out, you were the only person who sent me an email afterward, and it just said, 'I'm sorry, I hope you land somewhere good.' Nobody else said anything, Elena. I've thought about that email more than I probably should have. I hadn't remembered sending it. It felt, hearing him describe it, like something a different woman had done. A woman who still believed loyalty moved in more than one direction. "There's a due diligence call tomorrow," Marcus said. 10 a.m., Meridian's legal team, Daniel, his board. "If you're not on the patents in any of the transfer documents, and the diligence team confirms ownership sits outside the company entirely, the whole valuation collapses. They will want to know who actually holds that technology before they wire a single dollar. 10 a.m. tomorrow. Less than 20 hours from a conversation that would either save the company Daniel had built his name on, or reveal to a room full of investors and lawyers that the thing they were preparing to pay 9 figures for did not, legally, belong to him at all. "Elena," Marcus said, when I didn't answer right away, "what do you want to do?" I looked toward the hallway, toward the staircase Daniel would come down in a few hours, pretending nothing between us had changed, and for the first time since the champagne glass had caught the candlelight in that private dining room, I let myself smile. "I want to be in that room tomorrow," I said, "and I don't think anyone's planning on inviting me." I didn't sleep that night, not really. I lay beside Daniel in the dark, listening to the even rhythm of his breathing, and I thought about how strange it was that a man could sleep so peacefully beside a woman whose entire future he had rewritten without asking her opinion. At some point past 2 in the morning, I gave up pretending, went downstairs, and pulled the fireproof box down from the attic. 11 notebooks. I laid them out across the kitchen table in order, the leather worn soft at the corners, my handwriting changing subtly from year to year, cramped and uncertain in the earliest pages, steadier and more confident by the later ones. I found the entry I was looking for near the middle of Notebook 7, dated the week Daniel had first proposed filing everything under the company's name. I remembered writing it. I remembered my hand shaking slightly, not from doubt about the decision, but from the loneliness of making it without him. If I don't protect this now, I had written, I may spend my whole life building something I'm never allowed to claim. I photographed every relevant page. Then I called Mr. Halloway. He picked up before the first ring finished, which told me he hadn't slept much either. Mrs. Whitfield, I was going to call you first thing. I want to attend tomorrow's diligence call, I said. 10 a.m., Meridian's legal team. A long pause. That call is not typically open to family members. I'd need Mr. Whitfield's approval, or the board's. I don't need approval to be in a room where my own intellectual property is being discussed, I said, and I heard the shift in my own voice as I said it. Not louder, but harder, like something that had been soft clay for 11 years had finally been fired in a kiln. Mr. Halloway, you asked me 3 days ago why my name is the only one on those filings. I'd like the opportunity to explain that to the people who are about to spend 9 figures on the assumption that it isn't true. Another pause, shorter this time. I'll send you the call information myself, he said. I think, given the circumstances, that's entirely appropriate. I thanked him and hung up, and for a moment, I simply sat there in the blue pre-dawn light, feeling the particular quiet of a house that doesn't yet know it's about to change. Then I did something I hadn't done in longer than I wanted to admit. I opened my own old email account, the one I'd used before we were married, before Whitfield Systems existed, and I began drafting a letter to myself, a kind of ledger, documenting every date, every conversation, every quiet erasure I had absorbed over 11 years without complaint. Not for revenge, for clarity. I needed, finally, to see the whole shape of what had been done to me, laid out in my own words instead of felt only as a low ache I'd learned to live around. Daniel came downstairs at 7, freshly showered, humming something under his breath, and stopped short when he saw me already dressed, already composed, a cup of coffee steaming in front of me like any ordinary morning. You're up early, he said. I have a meeting, I said, and something in my tone must have caught him, because his humming stopped. What meeting? I looked at him then, really looked, the way I hadn't allowed myself to in longer than I could remember. Not at the founder the magazines wrote about, not at the husband who'd once brought me flowers on a Tuesday for no reason at all, but at the man who had stood up 3 nights ago and told a room full of people that I no longer looked the part of the life I had built with my own hands. The diligence call, I said, with Meridian. The color left his face slowly, the way it does when a person realizes a fact has arrived before they were ready to control how it landed. That call isn't, Elena, that's not something you need to be involved in. I disagree, I said, and I stood, rinsing my cup in the sink with hands that, for the first time in 3 days, were perfectly steady. I think, actually, it's the only meeting in this company's history that has ever truly needed me in the room. I was halfway to the door when my phone buzzed on the counter behind me. Daniel's eyes went to it before mine did, and I watched something close and calculate behind his expression, the particular look of a man doing frantic arithmetic in real time. It was Mr. Halloway. Before tomorrow's call, the message read, There's something in the original incorporation documents you need to see. I don't think Daniel knows it exists. I read Mr. Halloway's message twice before I trusted myself to respond. I don't think Daniel knows it exists. 11 years of paperwork, and somehow there was still a door I hadn't opened. I told Daniel I'd explain everything after the call, which was true, in the sense that mattered least to him and most to me, and I drove to Mr. Halloway's office instead of waiting for the video call to begin from my kitchen table. He met me in the lobby himself, a folder pressed to his chest like something fragile. The company's original incorporation paperwork, he said, once we were seated. The very first version, before Whitfield Systems became what it is now. You and Daniel filed it together, back when it was just the two of you and a business license. He slid a page across the desk. There's a founder's agreement buried in the appendix. It was never formally superseded when the company restructured for its first funding round. Daniel's team missed it, or never looked. I scanned the clause he'd underlined in pencil and felt the room tilt very slightly around a single sentence. In the event of dissolution of the founders' partnership through divorce, separation, or breach of good faith, all core technology developed prior to formal incorporation reverts in full to its documented inventor. He humiliated me in front of his family 3 nights ago, I said quietly. That's breach of good faith by any reasonable definition. I'd argue it's rather generous, as definitions go, Mr. Halloway said, and for the first time since I'd met him, something like a smile crossed his face. The call began at 10 sharp. I sat beside Mr. Halloway instead of at home, my laptop open, 11 notebooks scanned and ready in a folder I did not yet need to share. Daniel appeared on screen from his office, visibly startled to see me in the gallery of faces, and beside him, Meridian's lead counsel began the standard recitation of representations and warranties, that the seller held clear, unencumbered title to all core intellectual property. Before we proceed, I said, and the room, even through a screen, seemed to still, I think it's important the diligence team understand the actual ownership structure of the technology being valued today. I watched Daniel's mouth open and then close again, watched him understand, in the space of that silence, that whatever story he had told these people for months was about to meet the woman who had never needed to raise her voice to be believed. I explained it plainly, the patents, the dates, the founder's agreement no one had thought to reread. I did not accuse him of anything in that room. I didn't need to. Truth, laid out calmly and in order, accused itself. Meridian's counsel called a recess within 11 minutes. The deal, I learned later, did not collapse entirely, but it transformed into a negotiation between Meridian and me directly, for technology that had, in the eyes of the law and 11 leather notebooks, always been mine. Daniel called that evening, his voice smaller than I had ever heard it, asking if there was some way to fix this, some arrangement we could still reach. I told him, gently, that I wasn't interested in punishing him. I was only, finally, interested in being paid what I was owed for what I had built, in every sense of that word. The divorce was quiet. The settlement was not generous to him, but it was fair, and fair, I had learned, was its own kind of justice when you'd spent 11 years accepting less. Priya, I heard later, left before the ink on the acquisition papers had even dried, once it became clear which Whitfield the future actually belonged to. I still keep the 11 notebooks in the same fireproof box, though they live in a different house now, one with a garden I planted myself and no one else's name on the deed. Sometimes, in the evenings, I take them down and read the earliest pages, the cramped, uncertain handwriting of a woman who didn't yet know how much of herself she'd need to protect. She had no idea, back then, how far that quiet instinct would carry her. I like to think, somewhere, she'd be proud of who I became. If this story moved you, stay a while longer. There are more women like Elena waiting to be heard here, and I promise you, their stories are just getting started. Subscribe, and let's find out together where they go next.